cool stuff, huh? And all biomechanically based. We're going to get into, probably on Monday, I'll give you a couple take-home points from this video that are going to be on your test, so that way, we didn't do it for nothing. But this is a introduction of what's coming. We're going to talk about how humans are bound by your morphology, you're bound by your genetic capability. That doesn't mean you can't improve. That just means I can't be born this way and all of a sudden just train myself all the way up. Because you have certain windows of improvement based on your genetic limitations. And we're going to get into the biomechanics of equipment. We're going to get into a lot of cool stuff coming down the pipe, right? But now this is it, guys. This is the last circle that you're going to have to know. And first of all, let's get into.
See, there's a lot of stuff here. But it's not really confusing because the hip doesn't do near the stuff the shoulder does, okay? Like in terms of switching function, the hip is meant to move you, but you know what, more important than that, it's meant to stabilize you. You got a lot of muscles here because you cannot afford to have oopses at the hip joint. I mentioned this when we were talking about the shoulder. You can dislocate your shoulder and still get away from danger. It's gonna hurt, but you can still get away. You dislocate your hip, back in the day, you were done. So in addition to needing big muscles to move all of our mass, those muscles also serve stabilizing purposes in every different direction of force translation. So the way the class breaks down is we have anterior crossing muscles, they're going to be our hip flexors, pulling in the direction of hip flexion. We're going to have posterior crossing muscles, those are going to be our hip extensors. We have lateral crossing muscles, those are going to be abductors. We have medial crossing muscles, those are going to be our adductors. Remember, this is a right, so muscles that are trying to spin this way are going to be external rotators. Muscles that spin this way or pull in that direction are going to be internal rotators. Okay? A lot of these you've actually had at the knee. So we'll just look at their hip crossings and then add in some sharpshooters and a couple specialists. But the hip, to me, is really not that bad because you got a lot of function in the names of a lot of these muscles, okay? All right. First ones we're going to talk about is these psoas, man. Psoas, major and minor. They have the same function, sister muscles, so we just talked about it as the psoas or psoas muscles. The psoas starts on the lumbar vertebra. Remember how we learned this in 310. You really don't get a lot of trunk motion, more in the transverse ring, but in terms of like flexion, extension, there's not a lot there because you can't afford to move these guys because they have so much stability component, they gotta protect those nerves, those roots. So my point is that even though they're crossing lumbar vertebra, their contribution to trunk flexion is not enough to warrant significance. Now, their contribution to stabilizing those vertebrae is very significant. Like you can imagine those guys contracting to kind of compress to make sure that you don't have, excessive hypermobility. So look at that origin of those psoas muscles as more of an anchor, and their function in the trunk much more in stability than mobility. Crossing into the hip, it blends into a common tendon formed by this muscle on the other side called the iliacus. Let me get my little buddy here. And you see these little dots, and then you see this big red part on the ilium, on the pelvis. That's the iliacus. This is the psoas. They blend into one common tendon, like the gastrocnemius blends in with the soleus for the Achilles, right? It's just one common tendon. It crosses the hip right there, anteriorly, crossing the hip in the front, right on that AP axis, and it pulls on this bottom notch that we call the lesser trochanter. Does that matter? No, it doesn't matter where it's pulling. It matters how it crosses to pull there, right? So crossing the hip anterior to pull on this little knob right here, this little bony knob, means that it's going to pull in the direction of hip flexion, which means it's going to be a hip flexor. Now, I'm going to segue into a little bit of biomechanics here, which I told you I was going to. If you step on a rake, I don't know if anybody's ever done it, but just in the movies, you know, people step on rakes apparently all the time. There's rakes everywhere in these movies. But you step on a rake, and the force is very close to the axis. Now, where is the axis? The axis is literally where it's rotating about the ground, okay? But you step on those little prongs very close to the axis, and the other end moves very fast. That's a biomechanical advantage of a certain lever type. The key thing, though, is that that insertion of that iliopsoas, the combination of the iliacus and the psoas, is very close to that hip axis. So the point is, just a little bit of contraction distance of the muscles produce a sweeping range of motion on the distal end. So it has a mechanical advantage of fast hip flexion. So when you're sprinting, this is a muscle that behooves you to have good fast twitch. Because if all you got to do is shorten that muscle just a little bit, and the end result is whipping that rake on the other end, okay? And in terms of leverage, we call these third classes because of the speed, range of motion. You don't have to know that. I'm going to teach that to you in the next part, but it's just to show you this biomechanical advantage of a muscle that inserts very close to the axis. All it has to do is shorten just a little bit to get all the other end to move at a great distance. So for the purposes of this class, psoas major and minor, combining with the iliacus, we're going to call that the iliopsoas. Okay? Iliopsoas. So that's represented with IPS. But you can abbreviate it however you want. Remember, on the test, I'm going to say, what does IPS stand for? Okay? Never. The abbreviations is just to make the circles more palatable in terms of space. Okay? Iliopsoas, hip flexor. Also on this picture, we have our first adductor, the pectineus, but it also has another function. Once again, two-dimensional pictures, three-dimensional concepts. Remember how the pectoralis minor went anterior to posterior, but it was hard to see on the picture? Remember how seeing it as a protractor was kind of tough to see because we looked at it from the front? The pectineus starts on the pubis, and the pubis is in the front of the ball and socket of the feet. So the pectineus runs anterior to posterior, crossing the hip in the front. So the easy function to see is its adductor pull. But the harder function to see is that it'd be pulling anterior, it'd be pulling the femur forward because it attaches on the pubis. So it's a hip flexor adductor. So you see the pect is anteromedial on your circle, anterior because it crosses the hip forward, because it starts on the pubis, and the pubis is in the front of the hip joint. Okay? Bless you, bless you, bless you. Pectineus. We talked about the sartorius. We talked about it. Now we're going to talk about it in terms of its hip function. The sartorius, even though they're very close, the rectus goes to the anterior inferior, sartorius goes to the inferior superior. So they're both in the iliac spine areas. If you remember, these are just two different little bony nubs. Rectus here, sartorius, they're very close to each other. But two different bony nubs, crosses the hip in the front. So it's going to be a hip flexor. There is guys, I'm going to show you this. You have a ton of external rotators, bless you. You okay? Okay, it's all good. None of us are really okay, so it's all good. You have a lot of external rotator specialists that do a lot of the external rotation. So your instinct may be, whoa, this muscle kind of has some obliquity to it, and you're right. In fact, again, when I mentioned it as a Taylor's muscle, one of the reasons it gets shortened when you have a leg crossed over for hours and hours and hours sewing is because you shorten it at the knee, you shorten it at the hip, and you shorten it in terms of its rotation component. But in terms of actual contribution, it's very, very small, because I'm going to show you when we get into the back, you have some specialists back there that are some short shoes. So its actual contribution as an external rotator is very weak. So that's why I don't have it in your circles as a spinner. What was special about the sartorius in terms of all the muscles? Let's see if you remember it. What's special about it? It's the longest muscle in the body. That's cool. That might be a good test question. All right, another hip flexor is the rectus. Rectus femoris. I usually pull up a second picture so that way you can see where it inserts. So rectus. So that's sartorius origin. This is rectus origin. Still in the front, still crosses in the front. So still a hip flexor in the front. Now, if you think about it, what do the iliopsoas and rectus, they both cross in the front, but one inserts very close to the axis, so it's going to be really good at speeding up, making you flex as fast as possible. Rectus crosses early and inserts very far away. It's going to be a great muscle at slowing down hip extension, like usage at work. It's a good slower down muscle. Or if you need a lot of force, it has the mechanical advantage. Think of it like this: if you were going to lift up a ladder, well, ladders are heavy. Would it behoove you, if you were trying to get up something heavy, you want to attach your rope to a far rung to pull it up, not a close rung. It'd be very hard to get it up on a close rung. So it's very similar. That rectus has a mechanical advantage, inserting very far away from the hip to be a very forceful applicable muscle for large loads or for eccentric work, slowing down fast hip extension. It can put on the brake very efficiently because it inserts very forward. Okay, sartorius. Let's go back to our hamstrings, which you've had before. And this is where I'm going to lecture on semantics, guys. This is what's going to get you to get this question right and not get it wrong. The pectineus went from the pubis to the femur. This goes from the ischium to the femur. So the ischium is the back, right? That's your butt bone, that's your sit bone. So we're going posterior to middle, not anterior to middle. So these muscles are going to pull in the direction of the extension because they're pulling on your femur up to your ischium. However, these are the specific, Brian, this is how we communicate which of these muscles will function at the hip. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, but only the long head of the biceps femoris. So we don't say the biceps femoris functions at the hip because that would be saying both heads function at the hip. Does that make sense? But only one head functions at the hip, so we have to just say that one head functions at the hip. So it's the long head. So on your circle, that's why you have BF and then the little LH is to remind you that it's not both, it's just the long. Cool? That is going to be a test question. And guys, I'm telling you, well, maybe not you guys, because y'all did so well on the first test, but if you ask me, when you say biceps femoris, or do you mean both heads? I'm going to be like, you're taking the test on me. That's what I'm assessing. I'm assessing if you remember that when I say biceps femoris, I mean both heads. That's like the twins. When you say the twins did something, you mean both. But when one of them did something, you name them by name. Long head, short head. Okay? So the short head doesn't get up there, so the short head doesn't contribute. Gravity is undefeated. So does everybody again understand that this is a tough visual to see because all you see is 2 dimensions. What you don't see is this. That muscle is doing, so let's say my left arm is the muscle, and let's say this is the ischial tuberosity, and it's going to the femur. It's pulling in a direction of this. it's going posterior to anterior, and it's pulling back like this. because we know the ischium is in the back. All right, speaking of sharpshooters, ooh, here's a good picture of that short head. Actually, I showed you this picture last time. Short head doesn't go anywhere near there, so we don't give it credit. You have some sharpshooter external rotators. And when I say sharpshooters, what the analogy is that in basketball, sometimes you only have dudes that just shoot. Like they stand on the outside and people penetrate, they kick it to them, and that's all they do. Okay? 5 out of these 6, that's all they do. You know what they're like? They are like a souped up infraspinatus and teres minor of the hip. Lateral crossing muscles who pull on the femoral head, so they have no neck pull, so they're not going to be pulling adductor. Except for that piriformis, I'm going to get to the piriformis next. But gemellus inferior, obturator internus, gemellus inferior, obturator externus, and quadratus femoris are literally like a souped up group of external rotators. And you have this group there because a lot of our cutting and planting involves in external rotation of the hip, right? So having these guys that can just pull in that direction, I'm sure that's what their face looks like. Okay? Look at how they're pulling directly on the head. There's also some stability component in there as well, right? Extra stability. But the key thing is that they are external rotators. So how do we communicate it? We put all of those sharpshooters in a bowl, and then we put the bowl on both axes, meaning that they cross both. They sit on both the AP and the bilateral. So there's no flexion, extension, adduction. They are literally right on the AP and the bilateral, and their only function is spin. Does everybody understand that? Okay? And now we're going to get to that piriformis. So the piriformis is like, what's a good analogy? Piriformis is a more versatile player. Piriformis can still shoot, but the piriformis can do some other stuff as well. Okay? Piriformis, again, this is a two-dimensional picture for a three-dimensional concept. The piriformis runs in such a way where it has transverse pull, which is going to be the external rotation pull, but it has lateral pull as well, which means it's going to pull in the direction of abduction. And you can look at it, and you can see how, you look at all those quadratus and all those obturators, they're very horizontal, right? And all of a sudden you get to the piriformis and it's very angled. There's an X and a Y component. There's an up and an across component. The across component is going to be a spinner, and the vertical component is going to be an abductor. Now, probably all of you have heard about the piriformis. Piriformis there's piriformis is piriformis there. The reason the piriformis is such an important muscle for problems is every single one of us is some type of mutant. Meaning one ear is a little lower than the other, and one eye is a little higher than the other, one leg is a little, nobody is perfect. Everybody has some mechanical flaw. For you have a lot of wiring that comes out. Here we have the brachial plexus. We have another plexus network in our lower extremity that branches off into our legs. And what's fascinating and interesting is that each of you may have that plexus pass different ways near the piriformis. Some people have that nerve go through the piriformis. Some it's on the top, some it's on the bottom. Everybody's different. So the piriformis is kind of a trigger for some people with radiating pain, sciatic pain, because maybe they were born with their sciatic nerve going through the piriformis, or that piriformis is spasm tight in a sling a lot, and it's real tight. It can be constantly pinching off. If you're born with the sciatic nerve underneath and it's real tight, you can pinch off. So there's these factors that you just have real tight muscles. Now, the fun thing about the piriformis is that it's a midway muscle. The only reason I'm giving you this is because of stretching implications. We know, or we can see, that it has a abductor and an external rotation pull, right? Okay. However, looking at its line of pull, once my femur gets here, all it does is pull in mostly a direction of horizontal abduction. Watch what happens if I keep flexing. If I keep flexing, it goes from being an external rotator to being an internal rotator. Now, why is that important? That's important when people do these kind of stretches for the piriformis, because you have to switch its function. You have to flex enough for it to become an internal rotator, so that way when you externally rotate, you're actually stretching. It's pretty cool, huh? It's pretty cool. So that's the only reason I'm mentioning this, is because in terms of application, a lot of people do these kind of stretches. You have to make sure they flex enough to switch that sucker's function, so that way when you externally rotate, you'd actually be lifting. If you were trying to stretch it with your hip down, you wouldn't want to externally rotate. External rotate would shorten. Okay. Piriformis. Look at piriformis, abductor, external rotator. Oh yeah. So the following muscles, let's see. Tensor fasciatic release medial axis. Where do I want to start? TFL. I'm going to start here. Nah, I'll go in line. All right, guys. Tensor fasciatum is similar to the clavicular fibers of the pectoralis major. Now, you could also say, well, wouldn't it also be similar to the anterior deltoid? Yes, but I'm going to do another analogy when we get into the gluteus medius and minimus for the anterior deltoid. So you think about how the clavicular fibers run in such a way to pull this way and this way. Now again, this is just an analogy. They're not the exact same. They're not the exact same. Tensor fasciatum crosses in such a way to pull this way, but unlike the pec, so I guess technically we can't, I'm going to use the anterior deltoid twice, because it does have the same function. This way, and that way. Pectoralis major doesn't do that, right? Pec goes up underneath and pulls this way. Now, why is the tensor fasciatum of importance for biomechanics, injury, old people? This is a muscle that gets put in a sling a lot. In other words, our activities of daily living now in shortened, flexed positions. This is a muscle that's prone to get real tight. And this muscle, you see that anterior, on the anterior ilium? It's like on the front, right? Like here, and then it comes across and it blends in. You see that big band, that iliotibial band, and it crosses the knee, but it crosses laterally, kind of right on the bilateral axis. So in anatomical position, it's not trying to flex or extend you. But you know what it is trying to do? It's trying to stabilize you. Like when you go to cut and plant, guys, that's tremendous, what we call varus stresses being placed on your knee when you go to cut and plant. So having an extra structure there to kind of help prevent this motion is pretty handy. So the tensor fasciatum blends into this big lateral stabilizing band, crosses the knee, and inserts into a little area called Gertie's tubule. In terms of its function, and its importance. Hip flexion, hip abduction, mild internal rotation pull because it is obliquated. But you know what's cool? Your pelvic position is going to determine how much of an internal rotator it is. You know how a lot of people have their pelvis tilted interior, they compensate by extending their trunk? So the more anterior tilt you have, the more it's going to be an internal rotator. Now this muscle fires a lot when we walk, more when it works even more when we run, because when you weight bear, when you run, that tensor fasciae lata working with your other abductors has to stabilize your pelvis. If it didn't turn on when you weight bear, your what do we call that, Trendelenburg test, right, to check to see how strong it is. So this muscle gets innervated a lot with running. In addition, that band that passes the knee gets strung a lot. What do I mean by that? Think of plucking a string. When you flex and extend your knee, there's condyles there, and because it crosses the knee on the outside, that string's kind of getting plucked every time you flex and extend your knee. You can even feel it. Put your hand lateral and do this and see if you kind of feel a little string pluck. Okay? When I was working cross country, I did an athletic training internship at NC State University, and I worked with track and field in cross country. And the video we watched, you know, you develop biomechanical niches. Do you think distance runners, do you think cross country distance runners need to be, for efficiency, do you think they need to be loose and flexible? They need to be tight as snare drums, so that they can get more elastic contribution. Elastic contribution is free. You stretch the rubber band, it wants to move you back. So the tighter they are, the more they can use the elasticity to move, the less they have to recruit stuff that involves ATP and that kind of stuff. These runners are tight. Comes at a cost. When you have tight muscles, and you're plucking that string over and over and over and over and over again, sometimes that string can get very not happy. And that's what IT band syndrome is pain on the outside of that iliotibial band from too much clicking, too much tightening. Okay? Tensor fascia latae, hip flexor, hip abductor, hip internal rotator. The gluteus maximus. Now they talk about, I need to kind of maybe double check this, but because it's all relative, like some people will be like, your tongue is your strongest muscle in the body. I think they want to say like your tongue is the most fatigue resistant muscle in your body. The gluteus maximus is very powerful. Not only is it a big, strong muscle, but it's a mechanical advantage. How it inserts, where it inserts, to give it a mechanical advantage of power. I'm going to lecture that on our last part. But a very powerful muscle. Now, what does power really mean? All power means is you have a lot of force, but you also have this speed component as well. Okay? Think of the equation for power. Work in regard to time. That time tells me there's a speed component. Anytime you do something for time, that's a speed component. So power is a blending of force and speed. Okay? So, like I told you, some muscles insert kind of close to give it a speed advantage of motion. Some muscles insert very far away. So where does power live? Somewhere in the middle. This muscle kind of inserts. Our deltoid is a very powerful muscle. It doesn't insert too close. It doesn't insert too far. Right down in the middle. It gives you some of both. It gives you the best of both worlds. A very powerful muscle. So imagine that muscle. Remember, the ischium is in the back, right? And I know there's some iliac crossing, but that's posterior ilium. The ilium goes, some of that ilium is in the back. Back here. So between the sacral component and the iliac component, pulling on that mid shaft, man, very powerful hip extension. Very powerful hip extension. Mechanically powerful. Physiologically strong, but mechanically powerful. What about spin? That would be like a souped up posterior deltoid, right? You see how it crosses in a way to pull in the direction of extension. We don't typically talk about the gluteus maximus as an abductor, and I think that's because we have kind of some better equipped mechanically crossing muscles, and I'm going to lecture on next. So in terms of its function, we usually just look at it as that hip extensor and hip external rotator. And again, some of that is the position as well. It depends on your pelvic position on contributing a little bit more, a little bit less as an abductor. Powerful hip extensor, external rotator. All right, we're going to finish up the rest of the muscles on Friday. Is anybody interested, before y'all leave, is anybody interested in staying after class Friday or Monday to help some 310 students learn a little bit more about motion and movements? You don't have to answer right now, but if you are, let me know, and maybe after class we can hang around and help some of them. And then I might take that into consideration at the end of the semester.